2, 1. Hi, welcome back to another edition of the Jacob podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Hare, joined by my co-host, Jacob Robaum. And today we are joined by a very special guest, Mike Clay. Thank you so much for being with us today, Mike.
Sure, guys. Happy to be here.
Mike is an NFL and fantasy football analyst at ESPN. He has won several awards related to fantasy football, and he's created very advanced stats that we use today in football. So let's just get right into it, Mike. How did you get into the fantasy football industry?
Well, guys, I've been a football nerd, a sports nerd since I was a little kid. So, I mean, this is going all the way back to as far back as I can remember, going to games and just, having notebooks and charting games. So I've kind of always had that itch to be involved in sports. And I was in college covering our sporting teams, commentating. I was a sports editor for 3 years. And then I got a job in accounting, but I still had that itch for sports. So, I loved football. That was my favorite sport, and I love numbers. I love sports, obviously. So I kind of just, tied everything together and started working on projections, and the rest is history. It's kind of just grown and evolved from there. Fortunately, I had some luck along the way, getting gigs at Roto World, being the person who started the fantasy section at PFF, and then, of course, meeting the right people and working my way up to ESPN. So it's been a lot of work, but it's been fun. I obviously love all aspects of it.
Did you ever see yourself in fantasy football, or did you see yourself more as a football stats guy who does the stats during the game?
I would say neither, right? I mean, it was a hobby. It still is basically a hobby and a job. I mean, I just thought, hey, I was kind of displeased with the projections as a fantasy player, so I thought I would kind of try to do it myself and make my own blog. I never thought it would amount to this, of course, but it just shows if you have a passion for something and you kind of do something to separate yourself and work your ass off too. It's not as simple as if you love something, that could be your job, like everyone always says, that sort of thing. Or you can do anything you want. You have to really work hard. You have to have a passion and be committed to it. And, not trying to pat myself on the back, but I think I'm an example of that, just someone who had a passion and worked hard to get where he is.
Yeah, for
sure. Definitely. And so each year you're tasked with making rankings and projections. So what sort of formula do you use to come up with those rankings and to make them accurate? Sort of how do you accomplish that?
Yeah, I guess I get asked that a lot, and my answer is always the old, how many hours do you have to talk about it? Because there's obviously a ton that goes into it. Again, that first system I built back in about a decade ago, I've mostly overhauled at some point or another. I've overhauled some section of it, but it all started with an empty Excel sheet, and I just built it out from there. And now it's tons of data, tons of sheets working together, and it kind of has branches, So there's the league team, offensive play caller, player level, where I'm kind of studying that sort of stuff, league trends, coach trends, team trends. And then I have kind of an automated side that works on rate stats like catch rate and yards per target, and the list goes on and on for the players. And then there's a kind of a more subjective side where we're kind of predicting carry share, target share, drop back share for players. And a lot of that's based on history, but also news, beat writer reports, common sense. There's a various amounts of things that affect that. And then it kind of all comes together for a big refresh at the end and spits out projections for the entire NFL. So again, it's something that's just part of my life on a day-to-day basis. I'm always adjusting for transactions and news and reports, and it's basically 365 days a year. I have this projection system that's constantly evolving throughout different parts of the off season and in season. So again, a lot to it, but it's very helpful, I think.
And how much change would you say you see in the rankings from maybe February when the Super Bowl ends as opposed to August and September leading right up to the start of the season?
Yeah, I'd say quite a bit. A lot happens in the off season. In fact, I sometimes look back at we always put out our first rankings like a way too early set of rankings out around week 16 or 17 of the prior year. And it's funny to look back at those and just see how things change so much. But, the off season is built for research and you're going to learn a lot of things. There's going to be coaching changes that have an effect. There's obviously free agency, and the draft and free agency was crazy this year. There's so much talent, and we also know, and certainly from a fantasy side, a huge injection of talent at those key positions as well had an impact. So yeah, it's they change a lot. It's pretty much the guys that have been around for a while that you kind of know where they belong, right? Like Julio Jones and DeAndre Hopkins and guys like that. You kind of you know where they belong. Everything else kind of gets mixed up behind them as the year goes on.
So with the season right around the corner, what are some of the biggest tips you have for drafting a team?
You know what? I don't think it's anything too clever. You know, I usually take the easy way out and tell you don't overthink it, right? I mean, you have your draft board, follow it. Don't force yourself to take one position here or there. You know, if you have specific targets you want, that's fine, but don't go over the top reaching, or it's going to end up costing you. But you know, in general, when I'm drafting, I'm focused on running backs and wide receivers out of the gate. Especially this year, I think running backs really top heavy, so I want to ideally probably get 2 running backs. I know that's a little risky because injuries are so prominent at that position, but I feel probably a little bit more comfortable doing that. But again, if I go receiver, running back, or running back, receiver, I'm fine with that. There's a lot of values at tight end, as we'll probably get into a little bit more here. And quarterback, you generally want to wait a long time. I mean, if you want to take a stab at a Kyler Murray breakout or something in the middle rounds, fine. But otherwise, quarterback deeper than ever before. It's crazy how deep it is, so you can wait there for a while.
Yeah, so like going with like a late round Drew Lock, you say is a better draft position than maybe going with a mid-tier, I guess, Dak Prescott.
I mean, Dak's going in the 7th round. It's not too bad. I mean, I think that's fine. Generally, someone like Kyler or Watson or Dak or Russell Wilson will fall a round or 2. And if that happens, it depends on who you're drafting with, of course. You can take a stab there. But I like, you know, Brady in round 10. I like Matt Ryan in around that same range. Carson Wentz can be had there. Drew Brees and Aaron Rodgers are in the double-digit rounds. Daniel Jones, I think, is a good sleeper in round 11. Big Ben in round 12. I mean, it just goes on and on. There's just so many options that there's no sense in reaching. And sure, you know, a guy like Locke's going in the last couple of rounds. He's a fine breakout candidate. A very interesting, super deep sleeper.
And also, you see guys like Mahomes and Lamar Jackson who have the potential to be selected in maybe the 3rd or even the 2nd round, and in some leagues maybe even the 1st. What would you say about reaching to select one of them that early?
Well, I don't love it. You know, I think Jackson's kind of a unique animal in that he can add so much with his legs. We've never really seen that before, so I'm not super opposed to that. Mahomes round 3 isn't too bad either, so that's about where they belong, I guess. But at the same time, if you take one of them, you're giving up some serious talent at running back or wide receiver. So that's why I probably try to stay away from that.
And sort of what sleepers would you say are sort of under the radar guys, maybe in rounds like 4 through like 7 that stand out to you coming into this season?
Well, 4 through 7, I mean, these days it's hard to find sleepers in that range, I'd say. But I'd say on the tail end of that, I think there's a lot of these young running backs who have been kind of cast aside by rookies. And you know, what we've seen certainly over, I'd say, the past decade is that second day or day 2 running backs, I should say. So running backs drafted in the 2nd or 3rd round don't really do much in fantasy in terms of volume and efficiency. It just isn't there. So think about Ronald Jones. You know, they drafted Keyshawn Vaughn. Think about Kerryon Johnson. They drafted DeAndre Swift and Darrell Henderson, who the Rams drafted last year. The same regime drafted him. Well, they drafted Cam Akers this year. So those 3 guys, Jones, Johnson, and Henderson, going in the middle rounds. I mean, it wouldn't be surprising if 1 or 2 of those guys had a pretty darn good season. So I think those are interesting sleepers. And I mentioned the tight ends. I think there's value on pretty much every tier at that position. So Chris Herndon and Noah Fant, 2 of the better yards per targets among rookie tight ends over the past decade. Both of those guys, super interesting, and they can be had late.
And also, you mentioned the tight ends. Rob Gronkowski, what sort of effect do you think his sort of target share will have on players like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin?
Not much, honestly. You know, I think there's plenty to go around there. I think the guys who lose there are Cameron Braid and O.J. Howard. I mean, the Buccaneers were, off the top of my head, right around a 20 or so % target share last season to the tight end position. So that was, you know, it's not like it was super low and now it's going to go up and steal from the receivers, but they're just not going to throw much to the running back, I don't think, and they're not going to throw much to secondary wide receivers or the 3rd or 4th wide receiver. It's going to be Evans and Godwin soaking up a pretty generous target share. And Gronk, I think, will end up 3rd in line in that group most likely. And that's enough for him to be where he was for the better part of his New England time, right? In that 15 to 20% share. As long as he's using near the goal line, we know they're going to throw the ball downfield. Bruce Arians is all about that vertical passing game. They can all be fantasy relevant.
And do you think the Buccaneers will move on from either Brate or Howard before the season begins?
I think that will happen if a team is significantly having a problem there, right? Like guys aren't working out, there's injuries, something like that. I think that's the scenario where they would try to make an aggressive trade for a guy like Brate or Howard. But they seem like they're fine going into the season with all three, and they have a short window here with Brady, 1 or 2 years, so it makes sense to try to load up now and make that short-term run.
And what players are you sort of down on for this season that you don't think are going to have the best year?
I mean, look, every player has value, right? So it just comes down to looking at ADP compared to your rankings, and that can change. 1 week a guy could be a guy I think is too low, and next week his ADP could fall and suddenly he's a value. So guys that fit that mold right now, I would say someone like Jonathan Taylor, right, who's going around the round 2 or 3 turn in 12-team expert leagues or competitive high-stakes leagues. That's too much for me. I mean, Marlon Mack, believe it or not, Marlon Mack, as effective as he's been as a rusher, has 0 top 20 fantasy seasons under his belt because he doesn't do much as a receiver, and I don't think that's going to change a ton this season. It's going to be a run-heavy offense, and they have Naheem Hines in passing situations. Mack's not going to disappear. I just mentioned day 2 running backs don't do a ton of fantasy damages as rookies. So Taylor, I think, is going too early, and J.K. Dobbins, perhaps the same kind of thing in Baltimore. I don't really understand that one a lot. I think Cam Akers and DeAndre Swift's ADPs are about right. And then away from running back, how about Cooper Kupp? Very reliant on the touchdown or on the in the touchdown department. The past couple of years, his production, his target share, his usage, everything dropped significantly in the final month last season. So I still think he's going to be a starting caliber fantasy receiver, but that ADP right now, which I think at last check it was round 3. Yes, still round 3. That's too much. I mean, guys like T.Y. Hilton, Calvin Ridley, Robert Woods, Tyler Lockett, Cortland Sutton, Keenan Allen, Adam Thielen, Allen Robinson, JuJu, all these guys are going after him. It just, that seems a bit bold for me.
Do you think
you mentioned Cooper Kupp?
JuJu could have a bounce back season, or do you think he could continue to go on the downfall?
Sorry, who was that? Which player?
JuJu SmithSchuster.
Oh, JuJu? Yeah, I think he'll bounce back. I mean, I was very, very on board with him last season. And, I mean, they played New England in week 1, right, in that brutal game. And then Big Ben goes down for the season in week 2. I mean, and then JuJu missed time with an injury. I mean, it was just it was as bad as it could have gone, I think, for that passing offense. They couldn't score touchdowns in the second half. It was just a mess. So I kind of scrapped that. I'm focused more on what he did his first 2 years. He's healthy now. He's still one of the younger star receivers in the NFL. So I definitely expect a bounce back season with Big Ben back.
And then one player, David Johnson, who was obviously traded to the Texans for DeAndre Hopkins. He's underwhelmed the past 2 seasons considerably in fantasy. What sort of fit do you see with him in the Texans offense, and what sort of numbers do you expect from him?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of an odd fit, right? Because they don't have another pure ball carrier. It's pretty much David Johnson, and that's it, right? Because their next in line is Duke Johnson. They don't want him carrying the ball too much. He's a passing down specialist, for better or worse. I mean, whether you agree with that or not, Duke Johnson is just used as a receiver for the most part. So also Bill O'Brien's offenses have not thrown to the running back very much too, which makes it another bit of a bizarre fit. So it's, to me, the way I project it out is David Johnson handling most of the carries there and certainly a reasonable share of targets, and then Duke Johnson helping out a lot in passing situations. I don't know that maximizes David Johnson's fantasy output. It probably is better off a little bit in non-PPR, but all in all, I think he's more of a mid to back end RB2. I mean, the efficiency hasn't been there for him for a while. That offense probably won't score as much. I just don't man, that trade was brutal. I just don't know what on earth they were thinking. Just a really, really bad decision there. But who knows? I mean, they're switching play callers this year, right? They're going to Tim Kelly. O'Brien's not calling plays anymore. Maybe they find ways to maximize both Johnson running backs. It's going to be really intriguing to see how that team does after that rough offseason.
And
So
another player they brought in was Brandon Cooks from LA.
Yeah.
What do you see with him as far as impacting that passing game?
Yeah, I mean, obviously a downgrade from DeAndre Hopkins, but that you can say that for pretty much anybody. But Cooks is a good player, good underrated player. He's been, I believe it's top 15 in yards per target for the past 5 seasons. He's been a top 15 fantasy wide receiver all of those years. For me, I ranked him 39th. So I think that's fair. I mean, you have um, Will Fuller there, assuming he's healthy. You have Randall Cobb in the slot. They like to utilize the tight end a little bit. You have Kenny Stills off the bench. We mentioned the running backs. Maybe they lean more on them in the passing game. But, yeah, Cook's a good player. Had some health issues last year. You're still a little worried about them concussions. But he's going to be a big part of this offense, maybe even their number one. So, for me, a fine flex target.
So sticking with the trade with David Johnson, how do you see DeAndre Hopkins' fantasy value with the Arizona Cardinals?
Oh, I love it. I love it for sure. I think this Arizona offense has a chance to be the breakout team in the NFL this season. And Hopkins obviously will be a big part of that. And look, I know some people have said, well, we don't know if he's going to get upwards of 30% of the targets in this offense like he did in Houston. Well, not to mention the team change and the quarterback change. But here's the thing, Christian Kirk was handling about a quarter of the targets last season. So you're telling me DeAndre Hopkins, one of the best ever at that position, can't handle 27 to 30? I think he'll be fine. So not to mention that Hopkins before Deshaun Watson was a super fantasy wide receiver, very productive fantasy receiver, and that was with just bad quarterback situations there in Houston. So he gets Kyler Murray, who again, we've seen Patrick Mahomes a couple of years ago break out and win the MVP in his second season. Last year, we saw Lamar Jackson in his second season break out and win the MVP. Kyler Murray's first overall pick. He is DeAndre Hopkins now. He's a wide receiver-friendly offense, head coach in his second year. I mean, he has breakout written all over him.
Yeah. Do you think Kenny Drake's value rises for next year, or do you think that people are overrating him?
You know what? I was just actually doing a little work on that. The volume for the running back position was not very good for Arizona, believe it or not, but he handled such a huge share of the touches and he was over his head in the touchdown department that bailed him out and made him look very good. But on the other hand, he still has very little competition. He's going to be the workhorse there. Again, this offense was very good in the second half last season, racking up the touchdowns. He's been super efficient throughout his career so far. And he's playing for a contract, right? They gave him the transition tag. He's going to play a lot, so there's a lot of motivation there as well. So, no, I like him. I liked him as a prospect. I like the situation a lot. So for me, I have him RB8 on my board. It does feel a little risky. I'll be honest. It feels like one that we could look back and say, well, yeah, we should have saw that coming. But there's a lot going his way as well, especially in this kind of new era of a lot of spread offenses in the NFL. So I'm excited to see what he does.
Sticking with the NFC West, obviously a very intriguing division with the Rams, the Cardinals, the Seahawks, and the 49ers. Who do you think is the favorite to win that division? Because obviously all four teams certainly have the ability to make the playoffs.
Yeah, I'm with you. Look, I'm sticking with the Niners, and that feels like the easy way to go. But my playoff predictions actually have a lot of turnover from last season. But I still think the Niners are the best team in that division. The defense is in good shape. The offense will probably have to lean more on the pass this year. But I love what Kyle Shanahan has done offensively. So I do think they are the top team in that division. I have Seattle at 9-7. I think they steal a wild card. They have Russell Wilson. He's fantastic. They're in good shape. The Rams and Cardinals, I have around 8-8, but would not surprise me again if the Cardinals have a breakout season. They need a few things to go right, but if Kyler's the real deal, they're going to win more than 7 or 8 games.
So sticking with next season, we all love to hear them. What are some of your bold takes for next season?
Well, I think I kind of teased one there, right? Like I think if I had to make a bold prediction that isn't too crazy, but is certainly bold, would be Kyler Murray taking the MVP, right? For the reasons I laid out. There's a lot of things to like there. So I would go that direction. I think if I'm going bold at another position, maybe how about Zach Moss? He's one of my favorite players in this year's draft. Like him, super efficient, good tackle breaker, super elusive during his college years. Fell to the Bills, and they have Devin Singletary there, but they do like to run the ball, and Moss will probably get the carries at the goal line. So I think if he is the real deal, he could come out firing and just have a huge rookie season. I'm super excited for him. And again, if we're talking fantasy, you can get him very late in your draft. And I think he's certainly worth a flyer for that reason, just because he could prove to be the better back there and one of the better backs in the league. I mean, his profile is outstanding.
Yeah, for sure. I feel that Devin Singletary's work next year is going to be impacted a lot by Moss, or do you think it's going to be the same as when they had Frank Gore last year?
I think that they will use Moss more than they use Gore. I mean, I don't think people realize that Singletary was playing like 70% of the snaps in the second half and in the playoffs. They were using him as a workhorse, and I don't know that they necessarily want to do that. In fact, they wouldn't even use him at the goal line. He's way smaller than Gore. He's way smaller than Moss. He's probably not going to score many rushing touchdowns, but he'll be their primary pass catcher. I'm just not sure he'll move past, maybe 10 carries or so. They probably want to get Moss about half of them. And again, if he's out rushing Singletary, he may get more of them. So I think there's room for both in that offense. But yeah, the fact that I love Moss so much makes me a little nervous about Singletary's value.
Yeah.
And sort of sticking with next season, a team, the Minnesota Vikings, who had a good year last year. They obviously they wanted to sort of shift away from the passing game and more to the running game, and they succeeded in doing so with Dalvin Cook. He had a great season. What do you think Kirk Cousins does this season? Obviously, Stephon Diggs went to Buffalo. They brought in Justin Jefferson in the draft. How do you see him sort of playing out this year?
I think he's settled in as a competent quarterback, right? Maybe even an above-average quarterback. So I think he'll be fine for that team and help them toward a push to the playoffs. But as for fantasy, I mean, I have them throwing about 50 more passes this season. You don't expect them to be as significantly run-heavy as they were last season. Still run-heavy, but not quite to that extent. Probably the touchdowns and the efficiency regress a little bit to the mean. So all in all, probably a few fewer points than he scored fantasy-wise last season. Not a great fantasy quarterback. I mean, a pocket quarterback in a run-heavy offense, look, it's hard to score a lot of fantasy points. It just is. I mean, Phillip Rivers hasn't been a good fantasy quarterback for a long time, and that was on some good teams and good offenses. It's just the nature of fantasy football. So, again, I think Cousins is effective, but probably more of a back-end QB2 in fantasy.
Do you still see the Packers as the favorite in that division?
You know what? I think it's wide open. I think Minnesota and Green Bay and, believe it or not, Detroit are right there. I think Detroit's an underrated team on paper. They've basically stolen a lot of the Patriots' top players defensively from the past few years. So they've kind of put together a decent-looking unit there. And the offense was very good with Matt Stafford last season. In fact, the Lions were playing pretty well with Stafford last season. They were right around 500. They had the Chiefs beat. There was a bizarre fumble at the goal line that swung that game, or they would have won that game against the Chiefs. So, and then he got hurt and everyone else got hurt and the wheels fell off. They didn't win another game in the second half. So I think that the Detroit's a sneaky team, but again, Minnesota, Green Bay right in that mix as well.
So sticking with Minnesota former offensive coordinator Kevin Stefanski, what do you see for his new team, Cleveland Browns, on offense?
Yeah, I like him. I think that he's going to help add some structure to this Browns offense. Less YOLO ball, more, more. Yeah, again, I hate to reuse the word, but just more structure. We saw Baker Mayfield really struggle when he was not pressured last season, and I don't know what that was about because he was so efficient coming into the NFL. It was a bit bizarre, but he's obviously going to lean on either a balanced or run-heavy offense. We saw them sign Austin Hooper. They're going to lean on that tight end position. They're top-heavy at wide receiver, but they have two very good players, much like Minnesota last year with Thielen and Diggs. They have Landry and Beckham, a really good duo at running back. And we saw, as we kind of just talked about, we saw Stefanski maximize the running back position. They were near the top in pretty much every category of rushing and passing, rushing and receiving last season. Now you have Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. I mean, those two guys are going to be heavily involved as well. So I think the Browns, I've been projected for the 7 seed in the AFC. I think they steal that new 7 playoff spot there and kind of get back into the playoffs finally. That team is pretty good on paper. I'd say a little above average, and I like what Stefanski brings to the table.
And do you see a bounce back year for Odell Beckham Jr.?
A little bit. I'm not quite as bullish as some people. In fact, you mentioned, some underwhelming performers earlier. You wanted some underwhelming performers. I mentioned Cup. I mean, Beckham might be next on that list. Also is around 3 ADP. It's just a little rich for me because he got the volume last season, right? It's the same quarterback. I mean, it makes me a little nervous. I don't know. Maybe Stefanski can get a turnaround for him. Obviously, he has all the talent in the world, but it's been a long time since he's been a consistent wide receiver one. Several years, in fact. Missed a lot of games with injuries. Last year was underwhelmed. So I'm a little nervous about it. But, again, once you get into a couple of rounds after that, I'm more comfortable there.
Yeah, sure.
And so before we let you go, we have one final question. We need to hear from an expert. Do you prefer PPR or non-PPR and a snake draft or an auction draft?
Well, when I got to ESPN, we were non-PPR, and we're now PPR. So that tells you, as our standards, that kind of tells you, I guess, which way I have pushed for us to be. Obviously, that's not exclusively my call, but I mean, I had, I made my opinion known on that. So definitely PPR. I know it might not seem as fair because you can, catch a pass for 1 yard and you get 1.1. It's not, it's not the fairest thing, but at the same time, we're not playing real football. We're trying to project it out and show who's the most skilled. And that's another category we could use to try to predict and beat our friends in our fantasy league. So definitely prefer PPR. In terms of other formats, I mean, I like auctions a lot. They're a lot though. They take a lot longer, and you can't make your pick and kind of focus on your board and strategy. You have to stay on top of it all the time. So I like them straight up as more fun. I think I tend to build better teams that way. But I have no problem with the snake draft. I'm just used to it, and there's an element there of strategy I'm used to. So I like both. It's hard to pick. But I'll tell you what, guys, there's nothing better to me in fantasy football than a dynasty league. I love it. I love having a rookie draft, drafting a guy, and being able to keep him long-term, building that team, knowing it's there in the off season, being able to trade in the off season. And, if your team's struggling, you have a bunch of injuries or a down year, at the trade deadline, you could focus on next season, trade for picks, trade better. I just love that whole element of managing a dynasty team. So that's my favorite by far.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us today, Mike.
Anytime, fellas.